Cleopatra has become a cultural icon of ancient history. Portrayed by Hollywood as a super-intelligent femme fatale, many people forget that her intelligence was no illusion. If anything, the so-called Queen of the Nile possessed one of the sharpest minds of her time. Just take her decision to ally herself with Rome during a time when the Mediterranean was becoming increasingly Romanized and the eastern Mediterranean city-states were being targeted for conquest. This made Egypt into the last bastion of Hellenism in the East, a place where Greek culture and traditions would thrive for another few centuries. It also gave her an invaluable ally against her numerous enemies. One of these enemies, of course, was Octavian, later known as Augustus, who would become the first Roman emperor. With him was Mark Antony, one of Rome's greatest generals. The two had initially formed an alliance with Cleopatra after defeating their common enemy, Caesar. But once Caesar was dead, the alliance between Cleopatra and Rome began to crumble as both sides saw how strong the other was. The following power struggle resulted in Cleopatra and Mark Antony being declared public enemies of Rome. This meant war, an unavoidable war that would take place in 32 BC at Actium. This battle is one of the most famous battles in all of ancient history because of its sheer size. Over 800 ships took part in this conflict, making it one of the largest naval battles until modern times. Yet most people don't know about the role Cleopatra played in influencing the battle's outcome. To understand her role, we have to ask, how did this battle take place in the first place? In order to avoid a full-scale invasion of Egypt by Octavian, Cleopatra and Mark Antony decided to flee from Actium by land. They planned to sail around the southern tip of Italy and then make their ways through the Ionian Sea, eventually reaching Alexandria. This plan required them to pass through a narrow strait only a mile wide called the Narrows. Despite the risks of doing so, Mark Antony decided to follow this route with his 180 warships, 40 transports, and 300 auxiliary vessels. His main concern was the safety of Cleopatra, who was sailing separately with 60 ships filled with soldiers, treasure, and supplies. Upon hearing of Antony's decision to evacuate by sea, Octavian decided to intercept them. He dispatched Agrippa with 200 ships to catch up with Antony before he could reach the Narrows. The Roman admiral achieved this with ease and set up a blockade to prevent the Egyptians from passing through. Cleopatra's fleet was trapped. For 4 days, they endured bombardment by Roman artillery and continuous attacks by Roman boarding parties. By the 4th night, the situation had become untenable. Their food supply was running low and the risk of total annihilation was high. It was at this point that Cleopatra made a suggestion to her lover. According to Plutarch, she said to him, "Our situation is desperate. We can fight our way out, but it will be difficult. So let us win a glorious victory tomorrow and not disgrace our forces." Although Plutarch never says what Mark Antony responded, most historians agree that he agreed with his lover. Whether he agreed because he wanted to save face or because he really believed they could win, we may never know. What we do know is that he ordered his fleet to abandon the transports and engage the Romans in battle. But Cleopatra wasn't done yet. Before the fighting commenced, she personally selected 40 of her fastest ships, including those that carried her treasure, and positioned them in the rear of the fleet. As the battle began, Egyptian triremes engaged the Romans, while Cleopatra watched from the rear. It didn't take long for things to start going badly for the Egyptians. Within 2 hours, the majority of their ships had been captured or sunk. Yet Cleopatra waited patiently, watching the battle unfold before her eyes. The turning point came when Mark Antony noticed that Cleopatra had been missing in action. Concerned for her safety, he abandoned the battle and sailed towards the rear of the fleet. There, to his horror, he found that Cleopatra had fled, along with most of the treasure and supplies. She had taken advantage of a gap in the lines created by the clash between the two fleets to slip past the pursuing Romans. With her fleet gone, the remaining Egyptian ships lost all hope of victory and surrendered. A few of Antony's ships managed to break through, but without supplies, the men aboard these vessels soon found themselves in a hopeless situation. With no food or water, the men aboard these ships killed their horses and threw the bodies overboard, then drank the blood mixed with seawater. Eventually, they too surrendered. Only a handful of Egyptian ships managed to escape. According to Plutarch, Mark Antony chased after Cleopatra, ignoring the pleas of his counselors to come back and rally the troops. He brought along only 60 ships and spent the next 2 weeks searching for her, all the while leaving the rest of his fleet undefended. When the men on the undefended ships realized what Antony had done, they nearly killed him. They only spared him because his sister, Octavia, was married to Octavian. After 14 days, Antony returned with Cleopatra to Atunias and fortified the town. From there, they gathered a new fleet and prepared for a counterattack. Unfortunately, this would never take place. Cleopatra's hasty withdrawal from Actium had basically sealed their fate. Antony's fleet was either destroyed or held captive by Octavian. So any chance of winning a counterattack was slim to none. Instead, Cleopatra chose to play for time, hoping that Octavian would get bored and lift the siege. However, Octavian had no such intentions. He was going to finish the job he started. Realizing this, Cleopatra and Mark Antony ended their own lives. So, why did Cleopatra flee like she did? Most historians agree that she fled in order to break out of the blockade. According to them, she knew that if she stayed with Mark Antony, the Romans would destroy her entire fleet and capture her and Antony alive. By fleeing, she ensured the survival of some of her ships and perhaps even her life. This interpretation of events is supported by Plutarch, who wrote that Cleopatra intended to sneak out of the blockade and join up with some Parthian allies. However, a different explanation is offered by historian Robin Lane Fox. According to him, Cleopatra knew perfectly well that she could not beat Octavian at Actium. Therefore, she decided to fly and preserve her strength for another day. To support this theory, he cites a letter written by Roman statesman Cicero. In this letter, Cicero mentions that Cleopatra intended to use the treasures she had stolen from Actium to bribe her way out of the blockade. Both theories are plausible, but ultimately neither is provable. Why Cleopatra fled remains a mystery lost to time. But one thing is certain, her decision to flee completely undermined Mark Antony. Not only did he lose the battle because of her actions, but he also lost his dignity. Up until Actium, he had been seen as one of Rome's greatest generals. Now, he was nothing more than a lovesick fool who abandoned his duty. Because of this, his counselors convinced him to chase after Cleopatra, thinking it would restore his honor. Little did they know that this would lead to the end of their reign. To add insult to injury, Cleopatra stole a bunch of treasure from the Egyptians just before fleeing. This could mean that she was trying to preserve their resources for future resistance against Rome, or she planned to use the treasure as leverage to negotiate a peace treaty. Or perhaps she simply wanted to salvage something from the disaster that was Actium. Whatever her motivation, she definitely had her priorities straight. In conclusion, Cleopatra's decision to flee Actium played a critical role in deciding the battle's outcome. Had she stayed with Mark Antony and fought to the bitter end, things might have turned out differently. But by fleeing, she undermined Antony's authority, broke the morale of their troops, and paved the way for Octavian's victory. Furthermore, by taking much of the treasure with her, she demonstrated that her priority was to preserve their resources for future conflicts, negotiations, or perhaps even personal gain. Whatever the reason, her decision to flee sealed their fate. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you in the next video.